let's go ahead, and you should see in just a moment's time what you need to know for M66 Delegated Authority. So just a couple of key factors for this particular one. Obviously, it's a hybrid. It's in terms of the diploma subjects, it's a mix of coursework and also multiple choice. And so for multiple choice, you have 1 hour allowed, and you've got 50 what we call standard multiple choice questions in that. The author of this particular book is part of the LM series. So you might see a few of other kind of areas in terms of overlap if you've done LM books, the London Market books at certificate level. And there's a lot that goes into a little bit more detail of, so a few more people joining. So thank you. We'll see if we can get on with making sure that we get all these chapters done and dusted before the end of the session. So there's 8 chapters altogether, and they pretty much marry up with the learning outcomes. So as we go ahead, I've put basically in brackets between every chapter roughly how many questions are in the exam on this area. So for chapter 1, which very much provides a lovely insight and overview to delegated authority, we're going to look at kind of the key terms in this chapter, and it's worth about 7 marks. So let's get to it. As I said, I will just keep an eye on the chat in case anybody does have any queries, but we'll probably take them in the end on the basis that this is being recorded. And as usual, for any of you who have joined our session before, you might know that we actually give access for the weekend to the M66 on-demand course. So if you do require that, just let me know, just drop me a little message in the chat with your email address, and we'll make sure we get you set up after the session. Okay, so let's do an overview of delegated authority. So I've picked a few, I've tried to kind of siphon it down to just a few key points here, just to make sure that we fit everything in. So let's just go over some of the key terms. In this book, throughout this book, they refer to a cover holder MGA. So they put those two kind of phrases together. So when you actually break it down, we look at an MGA as being a managing general agent that is essentially tasked with being having a delegated authority from an insurer to write business on their behalf. But ultimately, they have no skin in the game. It's very much funded by their carriers, which are the insurers in the background and are the MGA's principal in this process. So they will underwrite the insurance risk, they'll do all the day-to-day stuff, but ultimately they've got no financial risk with writing those risks. Some key examples could be CFC, Dual, and so you'll see lots of MGAs across the market. The cover holder MGA is far more kind of wide-reaching. With an MGA, it's normally, I'd say normally, more often than not, a separate entity entirely, whereas a cover holder MGA could be a broker, they can be independent, they can be another entity, and so it kind of incorporates and captures a lot of other people in that as well. A carrier is just a provider of an insurance capacity. A TPA, which we'll also call throughout the session a DCA, which is a delegated claims adjuster, handles claims on behalf of insurers, or it could be a cover holder MGA that does that, or they could be working on behalf of a cover holder MGA. So there's quite a lot of different kind of areas and parties involved here. And then a service company, for those of you who did the LM books might remember that this is part of the same group of companies as who gives them authority. So normally you get a sister company or a parent company, in sense that that is the syndicate, and then the service company is given past the pen from that particular syndicate to essentially the service company to do business on their behalf, maybe in certain territories or things like that. So that's just another key term that will kind of crop up here and there in the book. With that in mind, let's just go to just very briefly talk about Lloyd's of London and make sure that we're okay with those terms. I've mentioned syndicate just now. Remember, a syndicate is essentially formed of individual or corporate names, which are members of Lloyd's. They group together, they get a pseudonym attached to them, and then quite often they will appoint a managing agent, so not an MGA, but a managing agent to do the day-to-day rolling of the business. So the age-old example here is Hiscox is the managing agent of Syndicate 33, and that's all within the Lloyd's of London sphere of things. Now we need to consider the documentation and the agreements and everything else that we're going to be talking about in this book. So the main types of delegated authority here, we're looking at a binding authority. I'd say the majority of this book is focused on binders rather than anything else, but that's essentially agreement that delegates that authority that I've been mentioning. So a binder would give the cover holder or the MGA or whoever it might be that distinct contract in place to say you're allowed to write business on our behalf within these parameters. And so we've got to be very clear from the outset of what's within that binder. If you've got risks that fall within it, you might hear some of your colleagues talk about risks falling within the binder. And so, oh, they can attach to the binder. And so often that's how we use that kind of jargon. A slightly separate kind of setup is that of a line slip. And you might remember from, again, previous studies that a line slip is a group of insurers, a pre-set group that is put together by the broker. And so ultimately, the broker doesn't have to go around on an open market basis, placing all this different business. They can simply put something on a line slip and they've got the security there and then. And so that really does help in terms of administratively and making sure that insurers can free up their time as well. So often the broker has to only go and see either the line slip lead. Sometimes they'll have authority to attach certain things to the line slip anyway. There's a key distinction here between what we call a bulking and a non-bulking, and I can almost hang my hat on the fact that this is likely to be a multiple choice question. I don't know why, only because it's something that you've got to remember. But ultimately, it deals with the presentation of the line slip to exchanging for data entry and so on. And so a bulking line slip is where certain things are all aggregated together. A non-bulking is essentially where every risk is presented individually. So we'll talk about more on that later on, but ultimately that's what the distinction is between those two. The final agreements that we need to consider and that are mentioned throughout the book is a consortium or consortia, plural. So a consortium is essentially looking at a group of underwriters similar to a line slip, the only difference being that the line slip is put together by the broker, whereas a consortium, I kind of imagine underwriters getting together for a drink outside on a sunny day like this in Leadenhall Market and saying, wow, you've got good expertise in this area. How about we put all of our heads together and get a pre-approved group of people to write this different business? We'll have you, expert, as the consortium leader, and you'll bind business on behalf of us. And so that's another way of delegating, but you're just delegating to a leader as opposed to a different entity entirely. So that's some of the key arrangements that we're looking at here. Now we just need to tee off a kind of a few other just types of terminology that get used. Again, this gets used quite incorrectly sometimes in terms of what's written, but one bordereau is without an X. Bordereau, plural, again, multiple bordereaux is with an X on the end. So sometimes you hear it or see it referred to as BDX, and that just stands for the bordereau. Now, ultimately, a bordereau is one of the main ways that we can actually monitor a cover holder MGA on either the risks that have actually been written in that particular period or certain claims that have been reported. In terms of when the timing comes for a bordereau, sometimes it will be quarterly, sometimes it will be monthly. It completely depends on the parties and what they've essentially agreed going forward in terms of what they will do. So that's something and a way that the data is actually captured and kind of reported back to the carrier, if you're an MGA, or to the kind of the principal insurer. And ultimately, there are lots of activities that can be delegated. It's not just underwriting. I'll say throughout today that about underwriting, about passing the pen to somebody. Ultimately, that's the old school way of referring to this. Underwriting, I would say, is probably the main activity that you can delegate. And you can do so, as we'll see a bit later, on a prior submit, pre-agreed rates and a full authority. So it depends on what parameters you're giving them to write business in. But other areas can be also delegated. So credit control, very common to actually delegate that. Document issuance and management, claims, very much, again, a delegated activity. And then finally, subrogation or recovery, so getting money back from third parties at fault or from other different insurers. The final part of this chapter that I just wanted to flag is just in relation to the different perspective on the roles of the different parties involved in this. So there's benefits and there's also disadvantages to operating either under a binding authority or other kind of areas like a line slip or a consortium. From an insurer's perspective, they might, by partnering up with a cover holder MGA, get access to business that they would never ever be able to get otherwise. So geographical regions, certain territories, maybe certain business areas that they haven't actually been exposed to before. They can also take advantage of lower operating costs. So they can actually say, right, we're going to kind of outsource this. We're going to delegate to the cover holder MGA, And we can also take advantage of their expertise. Say the cover holder is based in Chile and they're very au fait with writing Chilean business, and they know all of the different kind of clauses and codes out there. We can tap into that and we can say, right, we'll partner with you, we'll go through the approval process, but you're going to write business on our behalf and you're going to do it at a lower cost as well. So it's good for from an insurer's perspective. From a cover holder MGA's perspective, they've got a good, by partnering with insurers, oh, wow, that gives them kudos. They've got good reputational benefits. And also within reason, they've got certain kind of remit that they can actually run the book of business themselves as if they were the insurer. So they've got an autonomy to actually kind of do what they want on those particular risks. From the broker, obviously, from a time perspective, sometimes it's useful to have things on line slips and various other aspects, but ultimately they build a stronger relationship with the insurer or with the actual cover holder MGA. So again, to partner and distribute business with them. The only bits that are slightly, I guess, from a perspective of a customer, customers get very confused as to what's what. So if I say to my friends, they tell me they've got a business policy and I go, oh, great, who with? And they say Marsh. And you go, oh, well, Marsh isn't actually the insurer. And they don't care who the insurer is. Ultimately, they think that they're actually contracting with Marsh, but actually a carrier or an insurer is sitting in the background. So there are advantages that they can get some kind of a focused service because the cover holder is gearing up to see them. But in real life, insureds, policyholders won't actually be aware of who the actual insurer is. So that sometimes gets a bit tricky. And that's why something like a cover holder agreement and an MGA kind of setup needs to be either explained to the customer, or you need to be the point of contact so that they know that there's somebody else in the background. So that's chapter 1 done and dusted. For chapter 2, as I said, we're going to be going at quite a pace today because I want to fit in as much as the book as I possibly can. For chapter 2, we're going to go kind of straight into it. We're looking here at the legal and regulatory framework. Now, a lot of this has been covered at certificate level if you're there. If you've done recently MO5 or anything on those lines, you'll be familiar with some of this framework anyway as well. So this chapter has 9 marks attached to it. It talks first about the legal framework and then it goes into actual specific compliance and Lloyd's regulatory requirements. So let's have a little look at this. First and foremost, what I should mention is that there are kind of 2 sets or 2 kind of contracts within the delegation authority agreement. The first is the actual contract of delegation. That's between the insurer and whoever they partner with. So the cover holder, the MGA, the broker acting as a cover holder, which can also happen. And then the contract of insurance is completely separate in the sense that it's what the insurers are willing to provide cover for, but both of these combined together are essentially what will make the ultimate delegated authority agreement. Now, if we just look at some specific kind of key areas that this affects within all of the parties involved, remember, we've got this principle of law of agency, where it's a tri-party relationship, where essentially the principal can be the insured or the insurer. For the purposes of this book, we're thinking of the principal primarily as the insurer because they're the party that they're getting an agent to do something on their behalf. So the agent is the go-between, and then we have the third party, which can be the client, and that's how the law of agency is set up. So they talk a little bit there as a reminder of the duties between the parties when that's happening. In terms of any brokers involved, remember these are solo regulated, they are only authorised by the FCA, and so they'll look at their conduct. Whereas if you're looking at the regulation of the Lloyd's market as a whole, and then Lloyd's managing agents and other insurers, they are what we call dual regulated. So they are answerable to Lloyd's, who isn't on that list, but ultimately internal Lloyd's regulations, but also the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, and the PRA, the Prudential Regulation Authority. In terms of cover holder MGAs, and here's the key distinction here, they are solo regulated, so they are very similar to brokers in that they're only looked at by the FCA, and they're actually in some regulations defined as intermediaries. So what that means is, because of the law of agency, remember anything that's done from on the agent's perspective on behalf of the principal, they end up binding the principal. So if the agent has done something a little bit crazy in terms of underwriting something outside of the authority or whatever else it might be, ultimately the insurer is bound. Now, the key thing to remember here is they can't pass the buck in terms of regulation or legislation. It's their responsibility to make sure the cover holder MGA is doing exactly what they should be under the agreement. So that's the key distinctions there. A few other things just to mention. It comes up with our good old friend ICOBs, the insurance